Sword Art Online Alicization Lycoris' first paid DLC, MYOSOTIS aka Blooming of Forget-Me-Not, starts strong with impeccable character portrayals, features well-paced comedic bits that are probably the best in the entire SAOAL game's continuity, has very strong character moments, however, it suffers from the same overblown climax attempts that bog down the ending of the base game, trying to conclude with admittedly quite the epic ordinal scale like finale, but kinda really sabotages itself while attempting to land a perfect ending with very basic pacing issues. Welcome everyone, it's me Gamerturk, your best source of Sword Art Online information, and this is my ultimate review of Sword Art Online Alicization Lycoris MYOSOTIS. Now, for those of you impatient ones, I believe that intro should have been enough for you to make up your mind, but if it wasn't, I'll go ahead and say that this DLC is definitely worth your time one way or another, with its 4 chapter style leading to the final chapter, all offering a different taste with a different tone. So with the variety it offers, even in a worst case scenario, at least one of them will be your jam and you'll have a good time, regardless of the rest. While none of them are perfect and I have my issues with some of them, they all offer enjoyable and well executed stories in my opinion. So if you're leaving early with that short portion, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more. For those interested in a more in-depth look, timestamps are in the description for easy navigation between the topics we will cover today. A small disclaimer before we begin, of course, the DLC was included in the deluxe edition that Bandai Namco Germany provided me a review copy of. I have not been paid for this review, and Bandai Namco Germany had no editorial input in this review. In fact, I didn't even speak to them since receiving my review code before the game's official release. Well, those of you who have been around for a long time know my approach to reviews, and this one is no different. A disclaimer is still necessary for transparency in my opinion. Now, first in line is story, of course. That was a good 8 to 10 hours worth of campaign, presented in a lot of live 2D visual as well as in-engine cutscenes, and very rarely the stock animation in-world dialogue, which is only used when they literally do not have a choice since they do not have custom live 2D models for every single townsfolk, so that much I can excuse easily. The use of live 2D instead of static 2D is a massive blessing as it was in Ancient Apostles, but is especially more important here in MYOSOTIS due to how long some scenes can take, similar to certain sections of the main game. Having livelier sprites just alleviates so much of the issues that were present in the main game by making the visuals more engaging from the get-go. Although admittedly, well, it is not a surprise, it's still saddening that there are no Anima Inc. 3D anime scenes, but let's focus more on the good side. All the cutscenes are included in the gallery this time around, so you can watch the in-engine cutscenes themselves natively on your TV without having to either replay the story or watch the compressed versions on YouTube. I do my best to minimize the compression for you, that's why I started uploading 1440p to increase the amount of bitrate I am allowed, but you're still not getting the full experience and likely never will on YouTube. Going into the contents of the story, as we had assumed way too long ago based on MYOSOTIS' key visual when it was first revealed, we basically have 4 relatively isolated stories that are only connected by the fact that Kirito is technically on a sequential journey to hunt for divine object resources to craft himself a second divine weapon so he can protect Eugeo better by using dual blades because he had a nightmare of Eugeo dying during the fights against Quinella, which is what happened in the main canon. It is a good baseline for a story, especially if you consider from a canon point of view in the games, Kirito does not dual wield in Lycoris at all, with the exception of the first fight against Quinella back in chapter 1. Since Eugeo remains alive in Lycoris, he gets to keep the Blue Rose sword, and in the final fight against reborn Quinella, we do not dual wield Night Sky sword with Medina's Orthinano's sword, we just use the Orthinano's sword as a one-handed sword. So from a canon point of view, this adventure aims to bring back dual blades Kirito. Very early on in the story, during the intro chapter, we also receive a lot of exposition that not only introduces you to the basic concepts of a divine weapon like the memory of the sword, divine resources that act as the basis, how a divine weapon must resonate with the user to be fully utilized, etc, but also establishes finally that MYOSOTIS takes place before the events of the 4 free Ancient Apostles chapters we had received earlier, with 4 more coming in a single update in the future, with Cardinal explaining how she can craft divine weapons from powerful resources, and of course the holo communications device we had randomly discovered the existence of in the Ancient Apostles that made me question when Da Vinci modified our Shield of the Round Table. which was actually a simple modification to our Statia window done by Cardinal in MYOSOTIS. Alright, so with that setting up the stage, I will be going into some spoiler territory with individual chapters as well as the ending, so if you don't want spoilers, I will have a short spoiler-free recap of my feelings if you skip to this timestamp before moving on to other things. So, the first chapter takes us to a desert area in the Southern Empire where we investigate the appearance of some giants. The story is pretty rudimentary itself, which is more or less the case with most of these stories, by the way. It's a get to this point, slight exposition, maybe defeat an enemy, rinse and repeat until the story feels long enough for you to have a boss encounter kind of thing. Not that with the limitations of Lycoris there is any way to be creative, and no, having a 2-hour-long visual novel without any breaks, that's not a solution either, so I'm generally happy about this approach of breaking the dialogue into 5 to 10 minute blocks here and there and let you have some freedom in between. And to be frank, when the characters are written so on point and entertaining, it never feels like a chore either, since I find myself going for the next story prompt rather than taking a break anyways, because I'm just having a good time. We get a lot of good to great moments between Kirito and Eugeo, and then end up grouping up with other Integrity Knights, some of which are surprisingly not in the area, to address the seemingly big problem of a random ass ice giant that I am not sure whether it is a denizen of the Dark Territory or a named monster like the other 3 enemies we face, because while the game states it is a part of a force from the Dark Territory aiming to invade the human empire that was put to sleep by Quinella a long time ago, in case you weren't paying attention, an ice giant is not exactly a race that exists in the Dark Territory, but we'll gloss over that bit because the entire portion between Kirito and Eldrie is just so on point that I excuse the game for just pulling up an enemy out of its ass. The entertainment value of the chapter is undeniably much higher than this nitpick annoys me, even as a fan of the source material, you know? And while I will put the Kirito and Eldrie section on a pedestal, don't get me wrong, all the Integrity Knights, at least the ones who are remembered by this DLC, are such a great bunch with delightfully cheeky dynamics between them that the entire course of events just, it puts a smile on my face on a consistent basis. However, as I said, there is a however at the end, because none of these stories are perfect and do have issues that actually do annoy me. So, however, the entire thing just instantly became a nonsense for me when the entire motivation of Mr. Ice King Hiltzig here devolved down to, yeah, he wants to bone Quinella, alright? Huh? Is that really what we're going with here? It's pretty clear what they're trying to do. They just want to have a heartfelt moment, but come on, man, it's already not easy to relate to a fucking ice giant who is creating ice chunks and flame balls out of thin air to kill our heroes and just keeps shouting Administrator non-stop without any context. But when you don't even rig its in-game model to have some basic animation, not even mouth movements, so it just stands there as a solid statue, it's just... And talks about this boner for Quinella, it's awkward if nothing else, and the giant's dialogue is just overall so redundant as it just keeps repeating the exact same thing over and over. It overstays its welcome. As you feel like the narrative is just trying to hit you with a hammer yelling, "Did you get it? He really feels a lot of strong emotions, and that's why he can be a potent resource for a divine object. Did you really understand that he wants to convey love? It's a very strong emotion, and that's just giant felt for Quinella, which should also humanize him in your eyes, and you should feel some emotion too in this entire kerfuffle. You see, we even made Kirito incredibly understanding against this giant who just tried to incinerate an entire region in the human empire and just murder everyone in it, but he did it for love, and Kirito knows the importance of love. You get the point. Why is this a big annoyance? We'll get to that in the finale chapter, so we'll leave this for now. Anyways, we turn him into a spear, because of course we do, and realizing a spear is not a one-handed sword, Kirito continues his journey in the Eastern Empire. In the second chapter, we first explore the ruins, and our companion crew this time around are the real-world girls, Asuna, Shinon, Lifa, Shilika, and Lisbeth. Again, beautiful characterization and a much better use of the girl characters than just turning things into sexual fan service, where they're just constantly misled by Eugeo's pureness and taking things the wrong way, not because they're horny, but because Eugeo is just too pure in his retelling of events, so he is the one who gives the wrong implication. They also tried doing some creative stuff in this chapter with their 3D model dialogue scenes, like Shinon shooting a bow grazing Kirito's cheeks, so you know, I can only praise them from here. We know the limitations of the engine. Anything they try to do creatively to get around those limitations, to breathe some life into them, you know, it's a praiseworthy attempt in my opinion. But the narrative design, it's no different than in the desert. We just go through different parts of ruins, kill some enemies and get some dialogue. Not that this game has more to offer in regards to a narrative structure. And in the end, we find out the item we were looking for was already stolen, so the entire journey was for naught. But once again, the back and forth between the characters are just so good that it does not feel like wasted time at all. Your gain was simply having an hour of content with these characters, and it's not over either. We return to the nearby town where Eugeo is just hilariously shocked by the stereotypical girly behavior as Kirito teaches the pure boy the basics. We have probably the best ever cutscene in the entire Gameverse with Kirito, Asuna and a surprise appearance by Sortilina, and then have a run-of-the-mill tournament arc to earn the divine resource that was given at the local festival tournament, yes. But yeah, again, a little bit of creative approach to your narrative, just turning it into a tournament arc where you duel other players rather than run-of-the-mill go collect these quests. Again, little pluses are definitely there in regards to structure. Lifa accompanies you throughout the tournament, and she is the most little sisterly she has ever been, and is once again a joy to experience in my opinion. You know, if you're in it for a chill and funny ride, this chapter is pretty much the winner of the entire DLC. Sadly though, Kirito cannot use the battle hammer created from this resource in his dual blade setup too, so we must move to the snowy regions of the Western Empire now. Your companions, aside from the usual Eugeo, are Ronye, Tize and Medina, and Medina may confuse you if you never clear the true ending of the game, which is why I recommended in my, returning player's guide that you should do the true ending if you haven't. But luckily the DLC actually had an option to show you the true ending, unless you rejected the offer because you thought it was just gonna give you a summary of the base game, because the offer was not exactly clear in this language as to what it was gonna do. Anyways, this is our Blue Rose King chapter, the big mystery presented to us in numerous trailers, and it was kind of a dud if you ask me. Don't get me wrong, the build up to it was great, how it came to be was reasonable, how it shined a light on a side of Eugeo that he never shows was tremendous, but the entire thing was basically resolved in somebody needs a hug, which I found extremely unsatisfying. I know it was kind of a rehash of the S32 moment, so going with there are some things you can only convey by fighting for a second time in a row would make that parallel way too obvious to everyone playing, so they didn't want to do that. But come on now, power of friendship should not have been the solution here. Although I'll give it to them, Kirito talking to Eugeo was a great scene, regardless of how I did not like the solution they went with. Also, Kirito murders a bunch of guards, despite the entire thing being a dream. I don't think Kirito would be up for that. This is the guy who refused to kill box standard NPCs in previous games, but yeah, well, we killed a named monster at the end responsible for the dream sequence, which this fan art by Momo Knight Rose encapsulates perfectly. Find a diary, turn it into a weapon, and it's a bow, so the journey must continue. I'll open a parenthesis here, just go back to Eugeo. One of the reasons I really did not like this section is because there isn't really a conclusion or a follow-up. We had this entire revelation about Eugeo's inner concerns, and then nothing happens with it. The entire MYOSOTIS campaign is so episodic that none of the events, despite being somewhat world-changing, literally have zero consequences for other chapters. They are simply way too isolated. I understand some random tournament arc is not the most impactful thing ever, but being on this personal journey, seeing Eugeo at his lowest with such dramatized moments, it just feels off that nothing ever happens with these emotions of Eugeo, which I see as wasted potential in the best case scenario, or just an over dramatized bait and switch in the case of Blue Rose King in general, which just leaves a bad taste in your mouth, The high points were really high, but it was definitely held back by the fact that the entire drama was just a 20-minute ordeal, so much so that it made the high points feel out of place, or rather unfitting in this case. Fourth chapter really came out of nowhere, if I'm being honest. You go to the Northern Empire, you investigate some beautiful flower that everyone wants to have, you help a creepy noble ask someone out, and there's also a giant half-naked flower lady who's being presented to children of the town as tribute in a massive loop of murder in exchange for creating decoration for what the actual fuck is going on? By the way, aside from that entire thing, the story really glosses over it and tries to play it off cool as, you know, it's just a gameplay aspect, guys, but to me it looks like they just don't want you to realize Kirito actually killed a lot of doggos and human guards in this chapter. Anyways, aside from the shock value of this chapter and me trying to shy away from demonetization by keeping it short, this was a decent chapter on its own, but the early portion of it feels just much longer than it should due to the amount of speak to all the individual 36 NPCs across the map. Kind of a needless task, and the love story is taking multiple turns going back and forth. The attitudes of the Rulid trio kinda makes it worth it, especially the epilogue-like moment at the end, but the overall chapter would have benefited from some trimming action if you ask me. But yeah, the demonetization flower turns into a whip, so still no dual blades for Kirito. And that leads us to the finale chapter. We try to merge the 4 divine weapons we got so far, but something goes wrong because of course it does, there needs to be a finale chapter. Turns out that the ice giant who supposedly came to terms with reality has in fact not come to terms with reality, so he screws up the process. We fight the same 4 bosses back to back that we fought already in the previous chapters, then the giant guy eats the other bosses, which I'm not even sure why we had all these bosses in the first place, considering 2 of the bosses actually did not have anything to do with the resource used in the first place. They were completely separate entities. But it's kind of stuff you start questioning when you feel like the game is just trying to extend its runtime with an excuse. Anyways, the ice giant gets larger, so you just kind of defeat him again, which has terrible hitbox, by the way, because scaling him up just causes half of your attacks to go between his legs because it's just so large. Top tier QA testing there, good job. But when you do defeat him, he's still not defeated. He runs away from the isolated main visualizer room. However, that's really supposed to work because it's never really explained in the main game either. So you just chase him, you defeat him again. But turns out you still didn't defeat him, so Integrity Knights come in and save you. Well, those that this DLC decided to remember existed at least. So you defeat him again with the help of the Integrity Knights, but you didn't really, so Asuna and Co arrive to save your ass. So you defeat him again with Asuna and Co and the Integrity Knights, but you actually didn't defeat him, so Medina, Tiza and Ronia save your ass. So with the help of Medina, Tiza and Ronia and Asuna and Co and Integrity Knights, you defeat him again. But no, you didn't really, so Cardinal and Alice come to save you this time around. You see, I totally understand where the inspiration comes from. They tried going for an Arnold scale like epic scenario where things are looking very grim and suddenly a very heroic moment just turns the tide of the battle, and I would be totally on board if it was actually a heroic moment. The incarnation of the Radius fight in Ordinal Scale was about 5 to 6 minutes, 7-8 tops. The entire final chapter of this DLC is longer than the entirety of the Ordinal Scale movie. Every single cool and heroic moment is just followed by 5 minutes of nonsense, cheeky banter of visual novel dialogue that just further dilutes all these heroic moments, and that's one of the problems as well. There is not one single heroic moment that gets you hyped up. It's just constantly hyping you up and taking it away, hyping you up, taking it away, and it feels so redundant in the end. You feel exhausted with all these changes. But yeah, going back to the downtime in between these epic moments, like let Berkuli and Co come in, save Kirito, do your cool anime protagonist nod in your cutscene with, like, let Berkuli and Co come in and save Kirito, do your cool anime protagonist nod at your savior, etc. in your cutscene, and then immediately go back to fighting. Don't give us 5 minutes of visual novel. Asuna and Co save you in an incredible cutscene, thanks Asuna, and continue to battle in a perfect sync with her immediately without another 5-minute visual novel scene. Medina and Co save you in another cutscene, you know, just simply throw a jab at Medina, causing her to get into that Mukatsuku mode and just continue fighting, no more 5-minute pace breakers. Smile at Alice for saving you and switch in for an assault. Don't have a 5-minute visual novel scene in between every single hype moment in the middle of your climax battle. That just doesn't work. Stop doing it. It's not like the circumstances with the giant guy are changing. You just fight the exact same phase 2 version of him for the 5th time again. We We really don't need a pace breaker that serves no purpose at all. And you know, it was bad when we had to fight Quinella 50 times to finish the main campaign back in the original game. It's not any better when we have to fight the Mr. Ice Guy 50 times again. It just is the same mistake over and over. But hey, at least after that final Alice joining the fight, we are now actually allowed to defeat him and experience how Kirito apologizes from the giant because whatever, and offers to, and I quote, "Is it too late if I fill that spot?" Referring to the fact that the only goal of the ice giant was to bone Quinella. What the fuck is even going on at this point? I cannot fathom, but luckily, the ice giant refuses the kind offer and gets turned into a sword this time, so Kirito can have 2 erect swords in both of his hands again. Although, given the track record, I'm not entirely convinced that a random update won't arrive in the near future just to make us fight the ice cube again another dozen times due to contrived reasons. But yeah, I think both my praises and criticisms for the story were evident enough in my tone, but if I had to sum it all up in a non-spoilery way, MYOSOTIS' story offering feels too detached in regards to its own chapters, and there is not really a natural flow between them, except that they randomly culminate at the very end, tied together by the excuse of "I need to create a new sword," which truly does feel like an excuse here, as no elements from a chapter is ever used in another chapter to make the transition feel a bit more organic. You just go from one journey into another with a completely different tone and a completely different topic. The repetitive use of the bosses in a final chapter is once again a letdown, but that final phase 2 design was pretty cool, I'll give it that much. And while the story offers a good 8 to 10 hours, I do believe the story would have benefited immensely if it was just trimmed down to a 5 to 6 hours worth of content to avoid those redundancies and obvious attempts at extending the runtime. The individual chapters felt identical to the Ancient Apostles free DLCs, but had a lot less focused narratives, which I would have preferred not to have. But the good part is, most of it was filled with incredible character portrayals and emotional moments, providing an immense enjoyment in large bursts. Such a thing is definitely a rare sight to see from the gameverse due to the visual novel format usually leading to a more drawn out experience, although at some points it felt a little over dramatized due to none of the emotional beats actually carrying from one chapter into another and feeling like they're just own isolated thing. Finally, moving on from the story, I actually start questioning why I even tried structuring this ultimate review in a certain way. There isn't much to talk about aside from the story, since pretty much all the quality of life improvements are free for everyone, level cap is 110, all mutated beasts are finally available at all times, Ancient Apostles bosses got another massive level cap increase and are now dropping these XT weapons if you care enough to level them over to 100. New cube selections available, etc, etc. Alright, there is some additions here that are part of the paid MYOSOTIS DLC. The 4 divine weapons as well as the MYOSOTIS blade actually come with finishers, enhanced armaments in fact, but this made me realize that all the perfect weapon control additions we have been getting since the first Ancient Apostles release are not actually perfect weapon controls at all. They're just fancy finishers categorized as enhanced armaments. I have no idea how this slipped through the cracks for a game that paid a lot of attention to some other key details in its world building, but none of these enhanced armaments actually use a system call. They do not conjure any system windows upon casting that all the other actual weapons with memory abilities do. They don't even show any abilities, as all their animations are just continuations of basic physical attacks, like Shinon just shoots a bow, Teaser rushes with the sword, Kirito just spams more random swings, etc. MYOSOTIS DLC particularly stood out on this aspect because the game actually begins with explaining what a divine object is and how memory abilities function, etc. Yet here we are at the end of the DLC, and can anybody tell me what the memory of the MYOSOTIS blade is? Why does it resonate with Kirito? What kind of an ability it conjures when used? Like, sure, I can see the blade has some flowery aura when you cast it, but what is it? What's the significance of it? Well, what does it do? For a large story that specifically orients itself around what a divine object is, this is a massive oversight to just gloss over the one key aspect of the divine weapon you spent 10 hours creating. And now that I have realized that none of the original divine weapons actually act like divine weapons, I'm pretty sure the trend will continue with the upcoming 4 new Ancient Apostles free chapters too. I hope I end up being wrong, but that's a dozen weapons so far that established a clear baseline. But yeah, that's been my ultimate review on Sword Art Online Alicization Lycoris' first paid DLC, MYOSOTIS aka Blooming of Forget-Me-Not. All in all, quite the enjoyable time with the greatest characterizations to ever exist in the SAO games for most, if not all, characters involved. If you enjoy SAO games, this story will not disappoint with its portrayals. If you didn't enjoy the main campaign of Alicization Lycoris, I would still easily say MYOSOTIS is miles ahead in its narrative department, similar to the Ancient Apostles chapters, although it falls into some of the same traps of the main game here and there. Next stop, we'll be looking forward to the next 4 free story updates in the Ancient Apostles chapters, as well as the arrival of more SAO Gamers heroines, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more in-depth Sword Art Online coverage and news. Consider becoming a channel member to get access to a special badge and exclusive emotes to use. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook for faster news access, Sword Art Online, the first day merch, and more available on my Teespring page. And a huge thanks to all my patrons and channel members as usual. Until next time, keep your head